Good day. Over the course of the weekend, following the announcement that the Russians had captured the town of Bakhmut, which has been so bitterly and intensely fought over for many weeks and months now, the Western media, as I said, particularly the media in Britain, essentially retreated into denials. There were some stumbling admissions that Bakhmut might indeed have been captured by the Russians, but generally a refusal to acknowledge this reality. And of course, in that, the Western media continues to take its tune from information provided by Ukraine. The Ukrainian General Staff has not confirmed the fall of Bakhmut, and the local theatre commander, General Syrskyi, who is the commander of the ground forces, he's apparently or allegedly toured the area on Sunday, toured the battlefronts, and he's issued some kind of defiant statement saying that the Ukrainians are taking Bakhmut into a semicircle, that they can still control certain industrial and residential facilities on its western fringes, its western outskirts. He implies that the battle is still underway, and he still conveys the impression that Ukraine is gaining the upper hand. I have to say, none of this corresponds at all with the situation as it is being described to me by those who are on the ground. Firstly, I now have seen lots of films and pictures of Russian soldiers, Wagner organization soldiers, walking around Bakhmut. They look fully in control of the town. There doesn't seem to be any sign that they are under any kind of pressure or threat. I don't see here in these pictures any sound of fighting. I do wonder exactly where all this fighting on the outskirts is supposed to be happening, because there's no sign of it as far as I can see in these pictures, and all the commentary, all the information that I'm hearing suggests that this fighting in every part of Bakhmut has come to an end. And of course, Prigozhin himself has made further statements to the effect that Wagner is indeed in control of every millimeter of Bakhmut. Now, saying that, it's quite likely that there are still a few Ukrainian soldiers hiding in various parts of Bakhmut, and the Russians will need to carry out a thorough sweep to track them all down. And there's also some problems with mines. The town has been extensively mined, but these are the kind of things that have to happen after a place has been captured. They don't change the reality of who exercises overall control. And as for the Ukrainian advances on the flanks, which we've been hearing so much about over the last few weeks, as far as I can see, they've ground entirely to a stop. And it's been pointed out by a number of commentators who have more experience on military matters than I do, that these advances on the flanks have now become unsustainable and indeed have lost their purpose, given that Bakhmut itself has now fallen. The fact that Bakhmut has fallen, in effect, straightens the front lines. It means that, in practical terms, there are no flanks. There's rather a straight line, which is the front line, and that to the extent that anybody has been taken in a semicircle, it is the Ukrainians who still continue to hold some positions west of Bakhmut, like the important town or village of Ivanivska, where they're still apparently entrenched. So unless something changes radically over the next few hours and days, which I think is extremely unlikely, but then of course I'm not on the ground, but anyway, I still think it is extremely unlikely, I can't help but think that all these comments by Syrskyi, by other Ukrainian defense officials, comments that have been appearing in the media in the West, are basically attempts to manage a story whose outcome has turned out to be radically different from the one that the Western public had been led to think. I say that because most of the commentary that I've read in Western newspapers over the last 2 weeks or so has been of Ukrainian advances, of the Ukrainian offensive in the area, shifting the momentum of the battle, capturing kilometers of territory, lots of square kilometers of territory, north and south of Bakhmut, of the Ukrainians successfully resisting Russian advances in Bakhmut, of the Russians essentially being on the brink of losing the battle. So, given that this is what the Western public has been led to think for about 2 weeks, given that this is what the Ukrainian public has been led to think for a couple of weeks, it's perhaps unsurprising that it's proving very difficult to just suddenly announce that the battle actually has been lost and that the Russians have won and that Bakhmut has fallen and that the offensives on the flanks have ground to a stop. Now, I should say that before I did this video, there were some reports that the Russians themselves are actually on the attack. There were some reports, which, as I said, I consider very unreliable, that Khromovo, this village to the northwest of Bakhmut, which sits astride the main road, has been captured by Russian forces. I haven't seen any confirmation of this anywhere. But there are reports which do appear to be reliable that there is now an evacuation underway in Chasov Yar. And Russian officials like Marochko are saying that in reality, far from digging in to try to launch a counterattack to recapture Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces in the area of Bakhmut are actually gradually withdrawing and are being redeployed to other areas where they're now sorely needed, places like Kupiansk and such places, and presumably they will also be given something of a rest. By the way, on the topic of soldiers being given a rest, Prigozhin says that the Wagner forces, once they've withdrawn from Bakhmut, which he previously said would be on the 25th of May, that he anticipates they will be given a rest of around 25 days, and he seems to expect that they'll be back in action by the end of June, which I have to say is a lot earlier than that I had anticipated. I've now, by the way, been given another figure for the total number of forces that the Wagner organization, I stress the Wagner organization, deployed in and around Bakhmut. It comes from Ukraine, and it is 26,000. The Pentagon earlier said that there were 6,000 Wagner troops in Bakhmut itself. I think the 26,000 number is probably the more correct one if one includes other Wagner forces located in and around Bakhmut itself. But it is now, I think, acknowledged even by Prigozhin himself that even in the fighting within Bakhmut, some assistance was provided to the Wagner forces by paratroopers from Russia's 106th Airborne Guards Division and by naval infantry, by Marines, in other words. And I'm going to make a guess that those tanks, those Russian tanks, which we saw operating inside Bakhmut and which were shelling some of these big apartment buildings, and which proved very important in the capture of those buildings. Some of these tanks, which would look to be T-90M tanks, that they were actually being operated by tankers from the naval infantry, who, unlike the paratroopers, do actually operate tanks. So that gives us some idea of the nature of the Russian forces. I'm going to say, however, that it still remains the case that to all appearances, a smaller force, the Russian force, in capturing Bakhmut, has defeated and caused immense damage to a much bigger Ukrainian one. Now, Simplicius the thinker has produced an almost interminable list of the Ukrainian military units that were deployed to Bakhmut at various points in the Battle of Bakhmut. Simplicius the thinker's pieces are behind a paywall. He writes a Substack blog. By the way, it's a good blog, and if you want to get an interesting idea of the conflict, well, I would certainly suggest that you consider subscribing to it. But if you want to see this list of all these Ukrainian military formations, which, as I said, is enormously long, which Simplicius the thinker identified, well, you can also go to Larry Johnson's blog, Sonar 21. He has them all there too. And it seems extraordinary. It's an extraordinarily long list. And Larry Johnson makes the point that we are talking about tens upon tens of thousands of troops deployed at various times to defend Bakhmut by Ukraine. If one assumes that all of these forces were up to strength, or at least partially up to strength. And I do recall earlier in the Battle of Bakhmut, all kinds of maps were appearing showing the Ukrainian deployments near Bakhmut. And at one point, I remember that Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama counted 27 brigade-level formations, Ukrainian brigade-level formations, simultaneously operating in and around Bakhmut. And I believe that number eventually rose, or shortly after rose to 35. And enormous proportion of the Ukrainian army was concentrated in and around Bakhmut. Now, just to get a sense of proportion, to get an idea of what a huge commitment this Ukraine made to trying to defend Bakhmut, the Bakhmut fortress, as it was sometimes referred to, well, 27 brigades is more than double the 12 brigades that NATO and Ukraine have allegedly trained up and equipped in preparation for Ukraine's great counteroffensive in Zaporozhye region, about which we have been hearing so much about recently. Of course, if the number did indeed rise to 35, then that's 3 times the number of brigades that have been the number that is being committed to this offensive. Obviously, these 12 brigades that have been prepared for this offensive are up to strength, and the formations that were fighting in and around Bakhmut presumably mostly were not. So we're not talking about exact numbers of troops here, but it does give you nonetheless an idea of the extent of Ukraine's commitment to defending Bakhmut. And I've received some rather plaintive emails. There was one from a viewer who passed on a comment, a public comment made by somebody, a person with family connections to Ukraine, about the fact that more and more people in Ukraine are apparently becoming increasingly worried about what's happened to their loved ones, their members of their families who are fighting in the army. There's increasingly little news about many of them. Payments apparently have stopped in some cases. There's very little definite news about what has happened and happened to these men. And given, as I said, this intense commitment to defending Bakhmut, one has to wonder whether many of these men are dead or wounded in the fighting there. Now, there's been lots of discussion about how many Ukrainian soldiers were killed in Bakhmut. I've seen some extraordinary figures. I'm not going to go there and try to talk about those. I mean, all of these figures are based on rumours and suggestions, and I don't want to add to those rumours. What I will say, however, is that Ukrainian society is also becoming, I suspect, increasingly unsettled by the prolonged disappearance of the commander of Ukraine's military, General Zaluzhny. Now, General Zaluzhny has been built up both in Ukraine and in the West as a kind of heroic figure, a commander of enormous ability and skill. And he was, of course, on the cover, I think it was of Time magazine or Newsweek or one of those anyway. He's been widely built up as a sort of, well, a kind of General Lee type figure, I suppose. Americans will understand whom I'm referring to, the commander of the Confederate armies during the Civil War, a man of immense tactical skill as a general. And Zaluzhny, it seems to me, comparisons can be made that resemble the way in which General Lee was being promoted at the time of the Civil War by the people in the South. Well, he hasn't been visible for a long time, and we've been told all kinds of stories about where he is, that he's been attending a wedding. There's been pictures published of him on holiday in Cyprus. Why he would be on holiday in Cyprus at this time is mysterious, but people have established that those photographs were actually taken some time ago. And of course, rumours that he is dead or injured are also starting to gain traction. And I have discounted these rumours up to now, and I'm going to say straight away that I still don't believe them. But anyway, it's unsurprising, given his relative invisibility, that people are starting to have doubts and are wondering what has become of General Zaluzhny. And the reason I think that he probably is still alive and probably uninjured is quite apart from the fact that he's reported to have had some kind of discussion with General Milley, a telephone conversation with General Milley. I'm going to try and second guess what it was about, but apparently there's a video now appeared of him attending a Science Day conference. It appeared on YouTube. Odd place for it to appear, but there's a brief sight of him there, Zaluzhny there. He looked, from what I could see, safe and well. But again, it's not the kind of high-profile visibility that you would expect a general, the commander of the Ukrainian army, to be engaging in at a time like this, when there is a military crisis in Donbass and Ukraine is said to be preparing some kind of an offensive. Now, point can be validly made that we don't often hear very much about Russian commanders. Gerasimov, Surovikin, people like that, they too tend to be more on the invisible side, but that has been the style of the Russians throughout. Whereas Zaluzhny, by contrast, has seemed to court publicity. So why is he making himself invisible in this way? Well, I suspect that he's been unhappy about the fight over Bakhmut for some time. There were lots of reports that he wanted to pull the Ukrainian troops from there. He appears to have been overruled by Zelensky, the president, and General Syrskyi, the ground forces commander. And I also get the sense that Zaluzhny has little faith in this offensive that he's been ordered to undertake in Zaporozhye region. Back in the autumn, he gave an interview with The Economist in which he set out a shopping list of all the equipment that he needed: 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers. He's only received a fraction of that. And he's not just got a fraction of the armoured vehicles and artillery pieces that he wanted, but it seems that he's not had much in the way of the artillery shells that he says that he would logically need for such an offensive. And of course, what's also been happening over the last few days, weeks in fact, is that the Russians have been engaging in a huge bombing missile campaign right across Ukraine, striking Ukrainian targets, carrying out attacks on ammunition depots, oil facilities, logistical bases, warehouses, barracks, that sort of thing, right across the entirety of Ukraine. And yesterday was another case of this. There was an enormous combined missile drone attack, both cruise missiles and ballistic rockets, Iskander missiles, and cruise missiles, all of them struck Dnipro, the city the Russians call Dnipropetrovsk. There's apparently an enormous amount of damage done there. Again, the Russians are claiming that they've destroyed all kinds of logistical positions and ammunition dumps put together by Ukraine for the Zaporozhye offensive. Dnipro does seem to be one of the key base areas where the Ukrainians have been assembling their troops and their supplies for the offensive. It's logical that the Russians would therefore want to strike at it. Anyway, they do appear to have struck it hard yesterday, at the same time as they've been carrying out other missile and drone attacks right across Ukraine, and also bombing attacks, including, by the way, very heavy bombing on positions, Ukrainian positions, near Bakhmut itself, attacking Ukrainian troops located close to Bakhmut. And as I think I mentioned, there's now reports that there's an evacuation underway from Chasov Yar, this town to the west of Bakhmut, that civilians are being told to leave Chasov Yar, and that could be a sign, as I said, that there's not just a heavy missile and bombing campaign against Chasov Yar, but possibly a Russian offensive against this town. So, big Russian missile bombing offensive across Ukraine, hitting Ukraine's limited supplies of ammunition and fuel. And that might be another reason why General Zaluzhny doesn't want to be visible. He's not happy, that's my impression, with the outcome of the Battle of Bakhmut. He doesn't want to be blamed for it. He apparently advised against it. He thought that holding on to Bakhmut made little sense, and so it has perhaps turned out. And he's not keen on this offensive either. He feels that this offensive is a mistake, that Ukraine isn't ready, its forces aren't ready, and it's not going to achieve very much if it conducts this offensive now. And last but not least, the latest wonder weapon that the West has supplied to Ukraine, the British Storm Shadow. Well, if you believe Russian reports, the Russians are having no difficulty shooting it down. Like every day now, there are more reports from the Russian Defense Ministry of more Storm Shadow missiles being shot down by the Russian air defense. Now, again, there's no corroboration of this, but I suspect that these reports are true. We are seeing continued Ukrainian attempts at missile strikes, attacks by drones across the front lines, but they do seem to be increasingly ineffective. They're making little real impact on the battlefronts. They're not able, so it seems, to break through. And perhaps one last thing which tells us how surreal in some ways the war has become, from a Ukrainian point of view at least, is that earlier today Lots of reports were circulating that a Ukrainian reconnaissance group had crossed into Belgorod region, into Russia, and that they'd advanced and been confronted by the Russian army, and that there was intense fighting going on between this reconnaissance group and the Russian army, and we were all waiting to hear about the outcome of this fight, except that the Russians now saying that nothing like that happened, that the whole thing was invented, that it was a fake, that presumably the Ukrainian authorities engineered a story based around all of this in order, again, to unsettle the mood in Russia, possibly raise morale in Ukraine, but that this was a battle fought entirely in a virtual way. It wasn't real. Of course, I'm not in Belgorod. I'm not able to say definitely about this one way or the other. And lastly, just to tie up one last loose end, I noticed that Simplicius the thinker, in one of his latest pieces, has now re-examined what happened to that Russian air group that was shot down about a couple of days ago, the Sukhoi 34 and 35 and the two MiA helicopters. And he's come to the conclusion that this was almost definitely a friendly fire incident. In other words, this air group was shot down by Russian air defenses, mistakenly shooting down their own aircraft. There have been other instances of that over the course of the conflict. In other words, according to Simplicius the thinker, it didn't involve Ukraine. The Ukrainians weren't directly involved, and that might explain why, despite that incident, the Russian Air Force continues to operate across Ukraine without hindrance. Well, there we are. That seems to be, as far as I can see, the situation on the battlefronts in Ukraine today. Not, as you will gather, a huge amount of detailed information. With Bakhmut lost, a lot of the, if I can put it like this, reporting energy has gone out of the war. I do get the sense Pushilin is claiming, for example, that the Russians are continuing to make significant progress in places like Marinka and Avdiivka. I'll quote what he said. This was an interview Pushilin gave to Russia 24 television. He said, in the vicinity of Marinka and Avdiivka, the situation is consistently tense, but our units have the initiative. As for Marinka, we are registering a redeployment of reserves by the Ukrainian military, but it is still not as rapid as the advances we are registering in both the Marinka and Avdiivka areas, where earlier we also registered the redeployment of rather sizable reserves. Recently, this has marked the largest redeployment of reserves. So what Pushilin is saying is that Ukraine has rushed more troops to try to avert another collapse in the Avdiivka, Marinka areas, but the Russians still are advancing in both of these areas. About Avdiivka, I am sure he's right. I've seen maps. It does seem as if the Russians indeed are still advancing in and around Avdiivka. In fact, apparently they're on the outskirts of the town in several places. The situation around Avdiivka looks to me a little like what it looked like in Bakhmut in January. Just to say, with the encirclement of Avdiivka having actually gone rather further than that. About Marinka, I have to say this, Pushilin has made so many claims at so many times about the place being captured that I'm afraid I no longer pay much attention to what he says about it. But anyway, no doubt lots of things going on the battlefronts, very heavy Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. But at the moment, today, the major fight has been in the information space, if you like, with the Ukrainians still trying to claim that the Battle of Bakhmut is ongoing, even as all of the evidence from the front lines, from Bakhmut itself, suggests otherwise, with some suggestions, in fact, that it is the Ukrainians who are pulling back from the areas adjoining Bakhmut, and that the Russians might be gradually considering a push towards Chasiv Yar. And for the rest, major missile strikes across Ukraine, and General Zaluzhny hiding, because that's what it looks to me to be. Now, what does that mean for the future? Well, President Biden met with President Zelensky at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, in Japan, and gave a press conference. And it struck me that President Biden, in rather clumsy words, appeared to concede that Bakhmut had indeed been captured by the Russians. He didn't quite say that, but he came very close. He made an astonishing claim that the Russians had suffered 100,000 men killed in the capture of Bakhmut. I have no idea where he got that number from. All I will say is that I think it is not just wrong, but absurd, and has no basis in reality. But anyway, that was what Biden said. But he also had some things to say about the Ukrainian offensive. He said that he knows the date, that he's not going to say what it is, when it's going to start. And he said that Ukraine has all the equipment that it needs for this offensive. Now, I've said that I don't think General Zaluzhny wants this offensive to happen. He's got deep misgivings about it. President Zelensky has postponed it repeatedly. I think that what has happened, and this is my own personal view, is that on arrival in Hiroshima, Zelensky was confronted by the Americans, by Biden and his team, and they made it absolutely clear to Zelensky that they're out of patience, that they don't want to hear anything more about how Ukraine needs more weapons before it starts this offensive. They want this offensive to take place now, and they're not going to tolerate any more postponements or delays. And I think that Zelensky, for his part, has promised Biden that this offensive will indeed take place, and he has indeed committed himself to launching this offensive on a particular date. That is my reading of President Biden's news conference. So we are going to see this Ukrainian offensive take place at some point, and I'm guessing it will be fairly soon, probably this month rather than next month. There's still, after all, 9 days left to May. So we shall probably see this offensive take place, and all of this redeployment of forces, troops being sent from Bakhmut north towards Kupiansk and those places, all of that could be connected in some way with this offensive. It could be that Ukraine is going to try and launch some kind of diversionary attack to pin down Russian forces in the north, with what's left of the Bakhmut grouping of Ukrainian troops, even as the main offensive, I think everybody now acknowledges, is going to take place in the south. And all the indications are that the principal, at least one of the principal targets of this offensive, will be the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant at Energoda. And I've noticed that Rafael Grossi, the CEO of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has come up with some suggestions for demilitarizing the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, given that the Russians believe that the primary purpose of this Ukrainian offensive, or at least its initial objective, will be to try to recapture this nuclear power plant. I am sure that the Russians will not agree to its demilitarization in the way that Grossi would like them to. They probably would see that as simply an invitation to the Ukrainians to walk in. So we're going to see the Ukrainian offensive in probably the next couple of days, probably this month, perhaps conceivably in the first days of June. And then we will see what happens next. Lots of talk now about supplies of F-16 fighter jets. That may indeed happen. There may indeed be F-16 supplied to Ukraine. I think there will be. My own view, I know that there is a current view that the intention is to supply F-16s to Ukraine only after the war is over. I think, on the contrary, the intention is to supply these F-16s some point this year. I think that the political pressure in the United States has increased to do that, and of course the Europeans are also on side with this. I think the idea is less to force a change on the battlefield as to intimidate the Russians, to tell the Russians, look, our commitment to Ukraine is indeed open-ended. Even if you defeat this Ukrainian offensive, do understand that you will in that case be facing more and more weapon systems supplied by us to Ukraine, including F-16s. You'll be facing, in other words, a conflict in the air where historically we in the West are strong. I think that that is the intention, and I think the intention also is to supply these F-16s in order to force the Russians, or to put pressure on the Russians, to agree to that proposal that was discussed in Politico a few days ago, which is to get the Russians to agree to a frozen conflict in Ukraine. The Russians, by the way, have been talking extensively about the F-16. My strong impression is that they are unimpressed and unintimidated by it. They probably do not think that the F-16 is a game-changer system in the conflict in Ukraine. I think they sense that they can deal with it quite easily. But there is unfortunately something else. John Helmer, at his site Dancing with Bears, has pointed out that there has been a huge NATO air exercise carried out in Europe. And I'm afraid that he is suggesting, and he might very well be right, and I suspect there are some people in Moscow who think he probably the same way that he does, that this big exercise is ultimately a preparation by NATO, at least a dress rehearsal of some kind of air campaign by NATO in Ukraine. And he may be right. It may be that what the Americans are trying to convey to the Russians, apparently there's very little communication with the Russians underway at the moment, but what the Americans might be trying to convey to the Russians is this: look, even if you win your battles, even if you defeat this Ukrainian offensive that's coming, even if you are able to deal with the F-16s, even if you've knocked out our Patriot missile systems, you still won't be able to win the war, because in the end, we are prepared to intervene directly in the conflict ourselves. The fact that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, seems to be going out of his way to rule out this possibility, to say that Germany isn't going to supply F-16s, that it's not going to become directly involved in the war. All of that makes me think that Helmer might be right, and that these plans are indeed there. Because why would Scholz be denying categorically, repeatedly, something which he knows isn't going to happen? Isn't it more consistent with the way that he's acted up to this point, that he resists pressure to escalate until the point comes when he crumbles and agrees to escalate. And at the moment, he's going through the dance of appearing to be reluctant to go along with these plans for escalation, probably in the knowledge that he will himself eventually agree to them. So this is something that I'm afraid has to be taken seriously. Helmer might very well be right about this. We will see. But in the meantime, the Russians do have the initiative, even as they prepare for the Ukrainian offensive, which hardly anybody any longer appears to think can succeed or can achieve the great ambitious objectives that were being mooted a few months ago, severing the land bridge and all of that. Well, we will see what comes, and we will see what the Russians do and how they respond, and what the Ukrainians do and what happens over the next few weeks. But before ending this program, I do want to discuss another topic, which is, again, the sanctions war and the state of the Russian economy. Now, there's been an interesting article in The Guardian by its economics editor, Larry Elliott. Now, I should say Larry Elliott is to some extent a leftover, if you like, from older days when The Guardian was a rather different newspaper from the one that it is now. And he does still take, shall we say, a more traditional leftist view, a more skeptical view of things generally than the sort of neoliberal, neocon faction that seems to run the Guardian nowadays. I might be wrong about this, and if so, my apologies to Mr. Elliott. But anyway, he's written an article, and bear in mind, it's economics editor, and it's about sanctions. And he says the West's tightening of Russian sanctions is a sign of failure. And he is absolutely right. He says that the attempt by the Western powers to tighten sanctions is a sign that the sanctions actually are not working. And he says that despite talk of quick victory, there's been no knockout blow in the economic war, let alone signs that freezing assets, targeting oligarchs, seeking alternative energy sources, and depriving Russia of vital components has brought a change of heart in the Kremlin. And then he points out that whenever sanctions have been used in the past, their record has been mixed. He says that there's a risk in talking up such effect as the sanctions have had on the Russian economy, in the sense that, as Western policymakers know, their own voters are suffering from the collateral damage. Dearer energy, rising food prices, and falling living standards. A rare admission, by the way, in the Western economics commentariat, that the sanctions are indeed playing a role in the so-called cost of living crisis that many Western countries are experiencing at the moment. But then he goes to the heart of the issue. He says that the past 15 months have exposed the difficulties in laying economic siege to a country as well endowed with natural resources and technical nous as Russia. And he says that early forecasts from the International Monetary Fund that the Russian economy would contract by 8.5% in 2022 have since been revised to a 2.5% fall. In fact, it's a 2.1% fall, and my own view is that that figure is going to be revised at some point, and we're probably going to get a contraction of around 1.5%. That's my own view. I'm not going to go into the reasons why. He then goes on to say the IMF is expecting growth of 0.7% this year. Inflation is running at a 3-year low of 2.3%, lower than in the United States, the United Kingdom, or the Eurozone. And that figure, by the way, is correct. 2.3% is the current rate of inflation in Russia at an annualized basis. And this in advance of the summer, when historically prices in Russia tend to fall. Now, of course, that may not happen this year. We're dealing with all kinds of statistical quirks and fancies, but still, nonetheless, overall, the economy is, the inflation situation in Russia does look to be pretty stable. And he does say that things might be worse on the surface, worse than they appear in Russia on the surface. He says that there are reports of a brain drain of skilled workers and of shortages of spare parts. The last is indisputably true. There have been shortages, but this is the point about understanding the problem with shortages of spare parts. When spare parts are in short supply, that incentivizes producers to make them. So it is only a momentary thing, generally, when dealing with a technologically advanced economy like Russia's, with a big industrial base. Of course, you can also import some of these spare parts from other parts of the world, and the Russians are indisputably doing that. But this is a temporary problem. And of course, as Russian industry starts to replace some of these spare parts, its indices actually grow. A statistical fact which people don't understand much about. And as to the brain drain of skilled workers, the accumulating reports that, well, firstly, this was overstated, but there's accumulated reports appearing in the Russian media, anecdotal reports, that these are going into reverse, and a conversation with a Russian acquaintance, who is, by the way, an opponent of the Putin government, but who has been in London. Anyway, he has actually said that many Russians who did leave Russia are indeed planning to return because they found that their living standards in the West are significantly lower than what they were in Russia. And anyway, that's covering that point. And Larry Elliott goes on to say, 3 questionable assumptions underpin the West's belief that the economic war would be swiftly over. The first is that Russia would run out of money and so be unable to finance its military action, and that hasn't really happened because the Russians have had little difficulty finding buyers for their oil and gas. And of course, they've got enormous financial resources within Russia itself, a fact which is consistently missed and misunderstood as well. Russia now has a highly developed financial sector. Didn't always have that, but it does now. He says the second assumption was that the entire global community would be united in opposition to Russian aggression, and this has proved optimistic, and that's putting it mildly. And he says the final assumption is that the Russia of 2023 is no different to the Soviet Union of the 1980s, a basket case that will wilt under pressure from the West's superior economic model. Yet, as the US economist James Galbraith pointed out in a recent paper, Russia has an excellent education system, plenty of technical know-how, and industrial plants that have been built by Western multinationals since the end of the Cold War. Sanctions provided an incentive for the Russians to substitute homegrown products for Western imports. Though some techniques remain to be mastered, Russia is not short of any underlying ingredients: food, fuel, materials, scientific and engineering talent. Whether its economic leadership is of a caliber to use these resources effectively is an open question, but so far the contrary evidence is not compelling. On one point, I will push back a little on James Galbraith. The Russians do indeed have lots of factories now built in Russia by Western multinationals, especially car factories and things like that. But of course, it's a mistake to assume that all of the old Soviet industrial plants were just relics of the 19th century. Again, this underestimates the technological and industrial sophistication of parts of the former Soviet economy, as I have seen for myself. Just saying, just to make that little point. And of course, a lot of that old industrial know-how and technological know-how is now being strongly revived and is playing a big role in what we are now seeing. Well, all of this happens to have taken place at the same time as Vladimir Putin has had two sets of very interesting meetings. One was with his agriculture minister, Nikolai Patrushev. Now, Nikolai Patrushev, I should say, is an interesting, Dmitry Patrushev. Dmitry Patrushev, the agriculture minister, is, I understand, the brother of Nikolai Patrushev, who is the secretary of Russia's Security Council. So this is a pretty formidable team of the Patrushev brothers. One runs Russian intelligence, the other runs Russian agriculture. Both are very highly placed officials in Russia's government, very close to Putin himself. Anyway, Patrushev gave a glowing story about the state of Russian agriculture to Putin. He said that last year Russia achieved a record in terms of food production. He said that food production is now much higher than it was in Soviet times. And he has recently also given another statement to the effect that food production is still increasing. And he says that Russia is self-sufficient in every category, practically every category of food, and will be fully self-sufficient very soon. And of course, it's in a strong position to export food as well. Now, I haven't been to Russia again for some years now. Last time I was there was in February 2018, but I can confirm that. My experience in Russia was that, contrary to what many people imagine, this is no longer a country with food shortages. It is, on the contrary, a country of food abundance. And moreover, not only is food abundant in Russia, but it is actually pretty diverse in its nature and of very high quality. Anyway, that's all I would say. That's an anecdotal view. And I do get the sense that certainly since 2014, when the Russians imposed counter-sanctions, agricultural counter-sanctions on the West in response to the sanctions that had been imposed on them. But anyway, since 2014, I do get the sense that Russian agriculture has been in a consistent upswing. And for all I know, Dmitry Patrushev's claim that it is in effect in a virtuous cycle, that every improvement leads to further improvement and that output will continue to grow. I have no reason to doubt that. That does seem to be true. The other meeting was with the Russian government, and it was intended primarily to discuss the Northern Sea route. This is the sea route over the Arctic, along the Arctic coast. And there was a huge amount of discussion about that and the progress of it and its future and all of those things. But anyway, Putin used this meeting, which brought together many Russian officials, including the finance minister, Anton Siluanov, the industry minister, Denis Manturov, the agricultural minister again, Dmitry Patrushev, and of course the deputy governor of the central bank, Sergei Belov, and the prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin. They were all there, and they discussed an overview of the situation in the Russian economy. And they confirmed that the annualized rate of inflation is indeed 2.3%. Patrushev, again, this is Dmitry Patrushev, again reiterated that agriculture is on an upswing. Manturov said that there are still some areas in the industrial sector that are still lagging, that are still having problems. He didn't mention the car industry. He was actually asked a question about the car industry, and I noticed that he skipped an answer to that. My understanding, my sense is that this is the slowest industry to recover because it was the industry that depended most on Western-produced subcomponents. But anyway, he said that many industrial sectors are now reviving and are recording strong growth. And on the question of electronics, remember the question of the question that was asked about the state of the high-tech sector in Russia caused by the so-called brain drain. Well, Mishustin said that growth in the electronics sector last year was 22.5%. Now, that is just one of those figures that's thrown out. We don't know what it means. We don't quite know what the electronics sector means. Does this mean that microchip production has increased, for example, or does it just mean that simpler electronic goods are being produced in larger numbers? It's just a ballpark figure. It doesn't mean very much. But nonetheless, it does seem as if the electronic sector is achieving growth. And to my knowledge, again, Russia does produce some pretty sophisticated electronic goods. I've discussed this question of microchips many times, and I've explained why I think this is an overstated and misunderstood issue. The other thing that came across from this discussion is that real incomes in Russia now do seem to be rising. Well, this is a long discussion about economics, and interestingly enough, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the only part of it that I noticed any part of the Western media picked up on were certain comments made by the finance minister, Anton Siluanov. And Putin asked Mr. Siluanov, we have 2.3% inflation. This means that our budget revenues must also be at appropriate level. Is that right? Now, the point Putin is making, is that for inflation to be just at 2.3%, it must mean that the budget is under control, because one of the fastest ways in Russia that inflation would rise, this is actually what really happened in the 1980s, that the Soviet government, after Gorbachev became leader, engaged in very heavy unbudgeted spending, which resulted in flood of money pouring into the economy, which is not backed by goods and not backed by budget revenues, and that was what caused inflation to surge. We've seen something similar in the United States in the first year of the Biden administration, by the way. But anyway, so Putin is asking, look, we've only got 2.3% inflation, so that must mean that the situation with the budget is Okay. And Siluanov responded, Mr. President, yes, indeed, our non-oil and gas revenues are growing as planned. That is, we expect that there may be a small surplus in non-oil and gas revenues at the end of this year. However, the problem is with oil and gas revenues. For now, we can see that considering the current situation and all these discounts, they're lagging behind. And of course, there is the issue of expenditures. We see that now, today, literally today, we have fulfilled the plan for annual revenue to about 30%, and we fulfilled the annual expenditure for the year by 39%. Therefore, we have a temporary imbalance which should be levelled out as we further proceed with budget execution. So what Siluanov is saying is that the Russian government front-loaded its spending to the start of this year. So it's already spent 40% of the money it had budgeted for in terms of spending, whilst only receiving 30% of the revenues. And this has created an imbalance, and that imbalance has been affected to some extent by the fact that oil and gas revenues have been lower because of lower oil and gas prices and because of the fact that Russia has had to give discounts to countries like China and India for its oil and gas. But Siluanov thinks this is all going to be resolved. He says this is a temporary imbalance and it should be levelled out as we further proceed with budget execution. In other words, he anticipates that spending will start to fall, relatively speaking, from this point on, because so much of the spending was front-loaded, and by contrast, he expects that income will gradually start to increase and the two will balance out. Well, that's how I read Siluanov's statements. The Financial Times, for example, simply read them as him admitting to the existence of problems. Anyway, so overall, it seems to me that Putin and his officials are giving us the same picture as Larry Elliott did in The Guardian. Russia has seen off the sanctions challenge. Its economy is growing. The real living standards are rising. Industrial production is rising. There are still problems in the economy. Non-oil and gas revenues are also rising. There's going to be a surplus there. There's less coming in terms of oil and gas than in other years, but Siluanov seems confident that this is going to be resolved. And in fact, the latest budget figures seem to bear that out. So overall, the Russians are secure or feel secure in terms of their economic direction. And I'm going to suggest that this, for them, is the single most important thing they've achieved so far in this conflict. To repeat again, go back to what Larry Elliott said. This is essentially, first and foremost, an economic war. The very fact that the Western powers are talking about tightening sanctions is proof that the sanctions have failed. And Putin and his officials have given us some of the figures. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Look forward to you joining me again. Just to remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. Don't forget that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Check out our shop where we have all our amazing merchandise. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.